22-year-old Emma Rodriguez was chased through the Olympic National Forest by a massive Bigfoot at 3 a.m. Clutching her GoPro, she captured the beast's impossible speed as it pursued her through the darkness. Rangers found 18-inch footprints circling her abandoned campsite in unexplainable patterns. What Emma's camera recorded in those final moments is something that proves that some legends are horrifyingly real. On October 13, 2023, Emma Rodriguez had been in the Olympic National Forest for only 3 hours when she first heard the sound that would haunt her nightmares forever. The low, resonant call seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating through the ground beneath her feet and echoing from the trees themselves. She froze on the trail, her heart pounding as the sound repeated, too deep and too complex to be produced by any known animal, yet carrying an unmistakable intelligence that suggested communication rather than simple vocalization. The forest around her had fallen completely silent, as if every living creature was holding its breath in terror of what had just announced its presence. Emma's camera equipment began malfunctioning the moment she tried to record the strange vocalizations, her devices shutting down at seemingly random intervals, despite having functioned perfectly just minutes before. Her GPS readings showed impossible coordinates that placed her in locations that didn't exist on any map, while her compass spun wildly as if something was actively interfering with her technology. The silence that followed the creature's call was so complete, it seemed to press against her eardrums like a living thing, broken only by the sound of her own panicked breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath her trembling feet. But beneath that silence, Emma began to detect something else, the almost imperceptible sound of something massive moving through the undergrowth with impossible stealth. When Emma finally worked up the courage to continue down the trail, she discovered massive footprints pressed deep into the soft earth, prints that measured nearly 18 inches in length and showed clear evidence of opposable thumbs. The tracks formed a deliberate pattern around the area where she'd been standing, as if something had been circling her position while she remained frozen in terror. Most disturbing was the realization that whatever had made these prints had approached to within mere feet of where she stood, close enough to touch her. Yet she had never seen or heard its approach through the dense undergrowth. The depth of the impression suggested something that weighed over 600 pounds, moving with a grace that defied its massive size. Emma's attempts to leave the area were immediately frustrated by obstacles that seemed too coordinated to be coincidental. Fallen trees blocked the trail she'd used to enter the forest, positioned in ways that suggested deliberate placement rather than natural occurrence. Her satellite phone produced only static and interference that seemed to intensify whenever she tried to call for help, as if something was actively jamming her communications to prevent her from sharing her discoveries with the outside world. The isolation that had seemed appealing when she'd planned this expedition now felt like a trap, with Emma beginning to realize that she was no longer the observer in this situation, but rather the observed. Every step she took seemed to be anticipated, every route she chose blocked by obstacles that appeared too convenient to be natural. The first direct sighting came as Emma struggled to find an alternate route through the dense forest, her panic growing with each blocked path and dead end. Through the trees ahead, she caught a glimpse of something enormous moving between the massive trunks with impossible stealth, a figure that stood upright like a human but possessed proportions that suggested a creature of incredible size and strength. The being seemed to be studying her from a distance, its movements coordinated and purposeful as it paralleled her desperate attempts to escape. When Emma tried to focus her camera on the creature, the device immediately shut down, leaving her with only the terrifying memory of eyes that reflected the filtered sunlight with unmistakable intelligence, and what appeared to be curiosity about her presence in its domain. Emma's terror escalated when she realized that the creature was not alone. Sounds of movement from multiple directions indicated that she was surrounded by several large beings that were coordinating their activities with a precision that suggested advanced communication abilities. The forest itself seemed to be working against her escape, with branches that caught at her clothing in ways that seemed too deliberate to be accidental, and roots that appeared to shift position to trip her at crucial moments. Her attempts to document what was happening were frustrated by equipment failures that occurred at the most crucial moments, as if whatever was watching her understood the importance of preventing her from gathering evidence of their existence. The creatures seemed to possess an understanding of human technology that was both impressive and deeply unsettling. Emma's frantic escape became a blur of terror as the forest closed in around her. The deeper she ran, the more the landscape twisted. Paths vanished, landmarks shifted, and the air grew thick with the scent of earth and something musky. Every time she paused, she could hear the creatures moving just out of sight, their footfalls muffled, guttural calls echoing like a language meant for the trees. At one point, Emma tumbled down a slope into a shallow creek. The water was icy, shocking her back to her senses. She scrambled up, only to see a massive shadow pass silently along the ridge above. The creature paused, its silhouette framed by moonlight, and Emma felt its gaze settle on her like a physical weight. She pressed herself against the bank, barely daring to breathe, as the being let out a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through her bones. The chase resumed, but now the creatures were driving her, not just following, but steering her with uncanny precision. Whenever she tried to double back or hide, a branch would snap or a stone would be thrown, forcing her to change direction. She caught glimpses of more than one figure moving in parallel, their eyes glinting in the darkness, their movements impossibly fast and coordinated. Emma realized with dread that she was being herded toward a destination she could neither see nor understand. Suddenly, the forest opened into a wide, unnatural clearing. The ground was covered in spirals of stones and bones, and the trees around the perimeter were marked with deep gouges and strange symbols. The air was thick with anticipation, and Emma felt as if she had stepped into the center of some ancient ritual. The largest creature emerged from the shadows, standing at the edge of the clearing, its breath steaming in the cold night air. It raised its arms and let out a series of calls, each one answered by the others in a chorus that made the ground tremble. Emma stood frozen, her mind racing. Was this a warning? A test? The creatures circled the clearing, their eyes never leaving her, their movements deliberate and measured. For a moment, time seemed to stretch and warp, the world narrowing to the circle of stones and the silent, watching eyes. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the ritual ended. The creatures melted back into the forest, leaving Emma alone and trembling in the center of the clearing. She didn't wait to see if they would return. Driven by a surge of adrenaline, Emma fled into the darkness. The memory of the ritual burned into her mind. Even as she ran, she knew the forest was still watching, and that whatever had happened in that clearing was only a glimpse of a mystery that would never let her go. The psychological pressure of constant surveillance began to manifest in ways that Emma struggled to understand or control. She found herself anticipating the movements of her unseen watchers, adjusting her path to avoid areas where she sensed their presence, while simultaneously being herded along routes that led deeper into their territory. The creatures seemed to be learning from their observations of her behavior, adapting their tactics based on her responses, and becoming more sophisticated in their approach with each passing hour. Emma began to feel like a laboratory animal being studied by researchers whose intelligence far exceeded her own, trapped in an experiment whose purpose she couldn't begin to understand. The realization that she was being manipulated by something that could think and plan was more terrifying than simple predation. The most direct encounter came when Emma stumbled into a small clearing and found herself face to face with the massive creature that had been stalking her through the forest. The being stood over 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair that seemed to shimmer with an almost metallic quality in the filtered sunlight, with eyes that held an intelligence that was unmistakably aware and calculating. It studied her with the same intensity that she had been trying to use to study the forest, tilting its massive head as if trying to understand what kind of creature she was and what her intentions might be. The moment of eye contact lasted only seconds, but it left Emma with the chilling realization that she was being evaluated according to criteria she couldn't comprehend. The creature's expression seemed almost curious, as if it was encountering something as unusual to it as it was to her. Emma's attempt to slowly back away from the creature was met with a low vocalization that seemed to carry meaning, as if the being was trying to communicate something important or warn her about something she couldn't see. The sound was complex, with tonal variations that suggested it was part of a sophisticated language system, and Emma had the disturbing realization that the creature was actually trying to talk to her. When she continued to retreat, the creature's vocalizations became more insistent, and she could hear answering calls from the forest around her as other beings responded to what sounded like tactical coordination. The realization that she was surrounded by multiple intelligent creatures that were discussing her fate in a language she couldn't understand filled Emma with a terror that transcended anything she had ever experienced. The decision to run came when Emma heard the creatures beginning to move closer, their massive forms crashing through the underbrush with increasing boldness as they closed the distance between themselves and their subject. She turned and sprinted toward what she hoped was the direction of the main trail, her flight through the dark forest becoming a nightmare of stumbling over unseen obstacles and constantly looking over her shoulder for signs of pursuit. The creature's response was immediate and coordinated, with sounds of movement that indicated they were not willing to let their subject escape without a significant effort to recapture her. Their pursuit began with what sounded almost like disappointment, as if they had hoped for a different outcome from their attempted communication. The chase through the forest revealed the true extent of the creature's physical capabilities as they moved through the dense woodland with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for beings of their size. Emma could hear them crashing through the trees behind her, their pursuit coordinated in ways that suggested they were working together to cut off her escape routes and funnel her toward a destination of their choosing. The sounds of their movement indicated that they were not simply chasing her, but were actively herding her, using their superior knowledge of the terrain to guide her flight along paths that would eventually lead her back into their control. Their footsteps thundered through the forest with a rhythm that suggested they were matching each other's pace, working as a coordinated unit rather than individual predators. During her desperate flight, Emma began to notice that the very forest seemed to be conspiring with her pursuers, creating obstacles that slowed her progress while providing clear pathways for the creatures that hunted her through the darkness. Branches caught at her clothing with deliberate precision. Roots shifted to trip her at crucial moments, and the terrain itself seemed to funnel her toward areas where her pursuers could more easily corner her. Most disturbing was the growing realization that the sounds of pursuit were becoming more organized and strategic, with different voices calling to each other in what sounded like tactical coordination. The creatures were communicating constantly during the chase, sharing information about her location and coordinating their movements with military precision. As Emma stumbled through the undergrowth, her panic-stricken mind began to process details that her terror had initially obscured, fragments of understanding that painted an even more disturbing picture of her situation. The creatures pursuing her seemed to be using tools. She could hear the distinctive sounds of implements striking wood and stone, suggesting they possessed technology that no wild animal should have been able to create or use. Their vocalizations carried nuances that indicated not just communication, but complex language, with tonal variations that suggested they were discussing strategy and coordinating their efforts with a sophistication that rivaled human military operations. The realization that she was being hunted by something that could think, plan, and use tools was more terrifying than any simple animal attack. The forest around Emma began to take on an increasingly surreal quality as her flight continued, with shadows that moved independently of any visible source and sounds that seemed to come from directions that defied the laws of physics. She found herself running through areas that her rational mind insisted couldn't exist. clearings that were perfectly circular despite being surrounded by ancient trees, streams that flowed uphill, and rock formations that seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them. The pursuit behind her continued relentlessly, accompanied by phenomena that suggested the very fabric of reality was being manipulated by forces beyond her comprehension. The creatures seemed to possess abilities that went beyond simple physical prowess, as if they could influence the environment itself to aid in their hunt. Emma's terror reached new heights when she realized that her pursuers seemed to be enjoying the chase, their calls carrying what could only be described as amusement, as if her panic was providing them with entertainment rather than simply serving a practical purpose. The creatures appeared to be toying with her, allowing her to think she was escaping, only to cut off her route and force her to change direction. Their superior knowledge of the terrain gave them an overwhelming advantage, and Emma began to understand that her flight was nothing more than another part of their experiment, a test of her responses under extreme stress rather than a genuine opportunity for freedom. The psychological warfare was as deliberate as their physical pursuit, designed to break down her resistance and force her into complete submission. At one point during the chase, Emma managed to climb a massive fallen tree that had created a natural bridge across a deep ravine, hoping to put some distance between herself and her pursuers. But as she reached the middle of the makeshift bridge, she heard the unmistakable sound of the creatures climbing up behind her with impossible agility. Their massive hands gripped the bark with ease, their powerful limbs propelling them up the trunk with a speed that defied their enormous size. Emma could hear their breathing growing closer, deep and rhythmic, like the sound of massive bellows. And she realized with growing horror that they were actually gaining on her, despite her head start. The creature's pursuit took on an almost playful quality, as they began to demonstrate abilities that seemed designed to showcase their superiority over their human prey. Emma watched in terror as one of the beings leaped from tree to tree with impossible grace, covering distances that should have been fatal for any creature of its size. Another seemed to be moving through the forest canopy above her, keeping pace with her desperate flight while remaining almost completely invisible among the dense foliage. The coordination between the creatures was so precise that Emma began to suspect they were communicating through methods she couldn't detect, perhaps using infrasonic frequencies or other signals that were beyond human perception. As Emma's energy waned, she stumbled into a clearing she didn't recognize, one that seemed impossibly ancient, the ground covered in spirals of stones and bones. The air was thick with the scent of moss and something musky, and the trees pressed in so tightly that the sky was only a memory. The creatures paused at the edge, watching her with a patience that felt almost ritualistic. For a moment, Emma felt as if she were the centerpiece of a ceremony, the subject of a gathering that had been waiting for her arrival for centuries. The largest of the beings stepped forward, raising its arms and letting out a guttural call that echoed through the trees, answered by the others in a chorus that made the ground vibrate beneath her feet. Suddenly, the spell was broken. The creatures turned and melted back into the forest, leaving Emma alone in the clearing. She didn't know if she had passed some kind of test or if they had simply lost interest, but she seized the opportunity to run. Branches whipped at her face, and roots threatened to trip her with every step, but she pushed on, driven by a primal fear that drowned out all rational thought. Behind her, she could still hear the creatures moving, their calls growing fainter as she put distance between them. But even as she escaped, Emma knew the forest was still watching, and that whatever had happened in that clearing was only the beginning of a mystery that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The breakthrough that would save Emma's life came when she stumbled into an area where her cell phone unexpectedly picked up a weak signal, allowing her to place a frantic call to emergency services while still running from her pursuers. The 911 recording captured her panicked description of being chased by creatures that defied rational explanation, beings that moved through the forest with intelligence and coordination that suggested advanced cognitive abilities. Her call was interrupted by sounds that the emergency operator later described as unlike anything in their experience. Vocalizations that seemed to come from multiple sources and carried an unmistakable sense of intelligence and purpose. The creatures seemed to realize what she was doing and began calling to each other with increased urgency, as if debating whether to stop her communication or allow it to continue. Emma's call ended abruptly when her phone lost signal, but not before emergency responders had obtained her GPS coordinates and a recording that would become the subject of intense analysis and debate. The creatures pursuing her seemed to realize that outside help was coming, and their vocalizations took on a different quality, less playful and more urgent, as if they were debating whether to continue their pursuit or retreat deeper into the forest. Emma could hear them calling to each other in what sounded like rapid consultation, their massive forms still crashing through the trees behind her, but with less coordination than before. The change in their behavior suggested that they understood the implications of human authorities becoming involved in their activities. The sound of approaching helicopters seemed to trigger a fundamental change in the creatures' behavior, their pursuit becoming less aggressive as they apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor. Emma could still hear them moving through the forest around her, but they were no longer actively hurting her or trying to cut off her escape routes. Instead, they seemed to be withdrawing deeper into the wilderness, their vocalizations fading as they put distance between themselves and the approaching rescue operation. Emma's relief was tempered by the realization that her ordeal was far from over. She was still lost in a vast wilderness with creatures that could return at any moment if they decided the threat had passed. The creatures' withdrawal was not immediate or complete, as Emma continued to hear them moving through the forest around her for several more hours. They seemed to be maintaining surveillance of her position while staying far enough away to avoid detection by the search teams. Their vocalizations became more subdued but never stopped entirely, suggesting that they were continuing to communicate about her presence and the arrival of outside help. Emma had the disturbing realization that she was still being watched and evaluated, even as rescue teams worked to locate her position. The creature's ability to remain hidden while maintaining awareness of the situation demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication that was deeply unsettling. As the search helicopters grew closer, Emma began to notice changes in the forest around her that suggested the creatures were actively working to conceal evidence of their presence. Footprints that had been clearly visible just hours before seemed to be disappearing, as if someone was deliberately obscuring the tracks. Equipment that had been scattered during her flight was being moved or hidden, and the paths through the forest that had seemed so clear during the chase were becoming increasingly difficult to follow. The creatures appeared to be conducting a systematic cleanup operation, removing any evidence that might confirm Emma's incredible story about what had happened in the wilderness. The search and rescue operation that followed Emma's emergency call revealed evidence that supported her incredible claims while raising new questions about what had actually occurred in those remote mountains. Rangers found massive footprints throughout the area where Emma had been chased, tracks that formed complex patterns suggesting coordinated movement by multiple large beings. Her camera equipment was discovered scattered throughout the forest, positioned in ways that suggested deliberate placement rather than random dropping, with memory cards that contained hours of footage showing glimpses of enormous figures moving through the trees with obvious intelligence and purpose. The equipment had been handled with care, as if the creatures understood its value and had deliberately preserved it for discovery. The footage recovered from Emma's cameras provided the most compelling evidence ever captured of intelligent non-human life in North American forests, showing clear images of bipedal creatures that stood over 8 feet tall and moved with coordination that indicated advanced cognitive abilities. The beings appeared to be deliberately positioning themselves to be recorded, as if they wanted their existence to be documented, but only under circumstances of their own choosing. Most remarkably, some sequences showed the creatures using what appeared to be primitive tools and communicating with each other through complex vocalizations that suggested a sophisticated language system. The footage also captured moments where the creatures seemed to be studying Emma's equipment with obvious scientific interest, manipulating her devices with a dexterity that suggested hands capable of fine motor control. Analysis of the recovered footage revealed details that investigators found deeply unsettling, particularly the way the creatures seemed to be conducting their own documentation of Emma's behavior and responses. Several sequences showed the beings using what appeared to be primitive recording devices of their own, crude but functional tools that suggested they were gathering their own evidence of the encounter for purposes that remained completely mysterious. The creatures' behavior indicated not just intelligence, but also scientific curiosity, as if they were conducting their own research project with Emma as the unwilling subject. Most disturbing was the discovery that some of the footage had been edited or altered in ways that suggested the creatures possessed technical knowledge that exceeded what should have been possible for beings living in the wilderness. Emma was found 12 hours after her emergency call, discovered by search teams following the trail of broken vegetation and scattered equipment that marked her desperate flight through the forest. She was dehydrated and exhausted, but physically unharmed, though her mental state suggested she had experienced trauma that went far beyond simple fear of wild animals. Her account of being chased by multiple intelligent creatures was initially met with skepticism, but the physical evidence and recorded footage forced investigators to take her claims seriously. Most puzzling was her insistence that the creatures had deliberately allowed her to escape once they realized that outside help was coming, suggesting that their intelligence extended to understanding the broader implications of their actions. The evidence left behind after Emma's escape, strange tool marks, massive coordinated footprints, and her haunting footage, forced even the most skeptical rangers to admit she had encountered something far beyond a wild animal. The area was quietly restricted, and rumors spread of a hidden society in the forest. But Emma's story remained the only first-hand account. Her experience stands as a chilling warning. Some mysteries in the wild are not meant to be solved, and the silence of the forest may be watching, waiting for the next intruder.